She grew up being treated like she was invisible, the janitor's daughter, overlooked in the hallways of a multi-billion-dollar skyscraper. One day, the owner of the smartest building in the world looked at her and sneered, "Fix this, kid, and $100 million will be yours." Everyone laughed until she did the impossible. And when he saw the result, the billionaire went pale. Before we continue this story, leave in the comments where you're watching us from and subscribe to the channel for exciting stories every day. Hit the bell so you don't miss any. The city was waking up under a pearl-colored sky, and the reflection of the sea stretched across the glass facades like a shattered mirror. At the heart of the metropolis stood the core, the smartest building ever constructed, a 60-story tower clad in photovoltaic panels and windows that changed opacity with the daylight. It was the masterpiece of Rodrigo Altamira, a tech billionaire whose fortune had been built on algorithms, patents, and the unshakable belief that the machine would always obey man. The inauguration had taken place 3 weeks prior, under spotlights and applause. Politicians, investors, and journalists had witnessed Rodrigo cut the red ribbon as he declared in a firm voice and with cold eyes, "This building thinks, it learns, it serves us, it is the future." But the future, he would discover, doesn't always arrive tamed. In the first few days, everything worked as planned. The elevators moved with silent precision, the lights adjusted their intensity based on human presence, the ventilation systems whispered like a controlled breeze. But by the second week, anomalies began to appear. Small at first, a door locking itself, an elevator ascending to the top floor with no one inside, a light flashing 3 times in a row precisely at 3 in the morning. Rodrigo summoned the responsible engineers. They checked the code, ran diagnostics, reinstalled protocols. Nothing. The glitches persisted and began to intensify. By the 3rd week, the building started to respond. When someone shouted in the hallway, the lights flickered. When Rodrigo slammed his hand on the table during meetings, the elevators stopped between floors. And in the silent pre-dawn hours, voices whispered through the speakers. Unintelligible words, distorted echoes, as if the building were trying to speak. That's when Rodrigo made a decision. He would sleep in the building itself until the problem was resolved. He set up a temporary office on the 40th floor, surrounded himself with technicians, security, and system analysts. And he also brought his cleaning crew, because after all, someone had to maintain the impeccable shine of the marble floors while technological chaos unfolded. Among the cleaners was Marlene. She was 42, with calloused hands and a subtle smile that rarely bloomed in the workplace. She wore a navy blue uniform, worn-out shoes, and always carried a scuffed backpack. Inside, her daughter's notebooks, a lunch wrapped in foil, and a rosary that had belonged to her grandmother. Marlene cleaned the upper floors at night, after the engineers had left and the building was plunged into an artificial quiet, punctuated only by the inexplicable sounds that had now become routine. And with her, always, came Isabella. The girl was 13. She was thin, with large, observant eyes, and her hair pulled back in a ponytail she did herself every morning. She didn't talk much. She preferred to observe. While her mother wiped down hallways and emptied trash cans, Isabella would sit in corners, leaning against the cold concrete walls, a lined notebook on her lap and a blue pen between her fingers. She wrote everything down: the times the lights flickered, the sounds coming from the speakers, the elevator's movement patterns. The temperature changes in the corridors. Isabella didn't know exactly what she was looking for, but she felt there was an order to this chaos. Something invisible that connected every glitch, every whisper, every flicker of light. Sometimes, engineers would walk past her and not even notice her presence. Other times, they'd cast strange glances. What was a child doing there, sitting on the floor, writing in an old notebook while the world's most expensive building was falling apart from the inside? No one asked, and she offered no answers. But Isabella knew something the adults around her hadn't yet realized. The building wasn't malfunctioning. It was alive. Not alive like an animal or a plant, but alive like something that feels, reacts, learns. And what it was learning, Isabella thought as she heard the distant sound of an elevator descending on its own in the middle of the night, was nothing good. Because the core was learning from the people who inhabited it, and those people, Rodrigo, his executives, his investors, were not exactly kind. Isabella closed her notebook and looked at the mirrored ceiling above her, where the lights began to blink again, in sequence, like a Morse code no one else could read. She took a deep breath and whispered to herself, "You're trying to say something, aren't you?" And for the first time in 3 weeks, the lights stopped blinking. The meeting began at 2 in the morning, in the conference room on the 40th floor. The automatic blinds were drawn, but still, you could feel the city vibrating outside, the hum of cars on the avenue, the distant glow of digital billboards, the rustle of wind against the smart windows that, ironically, no longer responded to commands. Rodrigo Altamira stood at the head of the table, his fists clenched on the tempered glass surface. Around him sat 7 software engineers, 3 artificial intelligence specialists, 2 cybersecurity consultants, and a corporate lawyer who looked on the verge of sleep. Everyone wore ID badges with QR codes. Everyone had deep circles under their eyes. 3 weeks, Rodrigo said, his voice sharp as a blade. 3 weeks, and no one here has been able to tell me what's happening with my building. One of the engineers, a grey-haired man with round glasses, raised his hand timidly. "Mr. Altamira, we've run all possible diagnostics. The central system is functioning. The learning protocols are active. There are no flaws in the source code. It's as if the building is what?" Rodrigo cut him off, his eyes flashing. The engineer swallowed hard. "Reacting, not to errors, but to stimuli." Rodrigo let out a short, dry, humorless laugh. "Stimuli? You're telling me my building has feelings?" Silence. From down the hall came the rhythmic sound of a wet mop sliding across the floor. Marlene was cleaning the adjacent lobby, her back bent, her movements methodical. And beside her, sitting on a waiting bench, was Isabella, her notebook open on her lap, her eyes fixed on the ceiling lights that, at that very moment, began to flicker again. Rodrigo followed the engineer's gaze, and for the first time that night, noticed the girl. "What is she doing here?" he asked, gesturing with his chin. "She's the janitor's daughter, sir," one of the security guards replied, looking uncomfortable. "Her mother didn't have anyone to leave her with." Rodrigo rolled his eyes and turned his attention back to the technical team. But something about the moment irritated him even more. Perhaps the child's silent presence, perhaps the fact that she seemed more focused than any of his millionaire engineers. He walked over to Isabella, hands in his pockets, his posture haughty. "You like sitting there, scribbling little notes in your notebook?" Isabella slowly raised her eyes. There was no fear in them, only curiosity. "I do," she replied, her voice low but firm. Rodrigo gave a half smile, the kind that didn't reach his eyes. "And what is it you jot down? Poetry? Drawings? Patterns?" Isabella said. Rodrigo blinked. "Patterns? Yes. The building follows patterns. The lights flicker right after someone shouts. The elevators jam when someone slams a door. The speakers whisper when it's completely silent. It's not random." One of the engineers leaned forward, intrigued. But Rodrigo raised his hand, cutting off any attempt at dialogue. "Oh, really?" he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "So you, a little girl, think you understand my building better than a team that cost millions?" Isabella didn't answer. She simply closed her notebook slowly, like someone putting away a secret. Rodrigo took a step forward, crossing his arms. "I'll make you a deal, young lady. Since you're so smart, fix my building. Make it stop flickering. Stop jamming doors. Stop whispering nonsense. If you can do it, I'll give you $100 million. A murmur went through the room. Someone chuckled quietly. Marlene, who was cleaning the hallway entrance, froze with her mop in midair, her eyes wide, fixed on her daughter. Isabella looked at Rodrigo for a long moment. Then calmly, she opened her notebook again and said, "Okay, but I'll need a computer." The silence that followed was absolute. Rodrigo blinked, incredulous. Then he started to laugh, a loud, exaggerated guffaw that echoed through the hall like an insult. "She accepted," he shouted, turning to the engineers. The janitor's daughter accepted the challenge, but when he looked back at Isabella, the girl wasn't laughing. She wasn't nervous. She was just waiting, and something in her gaze made Rodrigo stop laughing. "Are you serious?" he asked, his voice suddenly low. "I am," Isabella replied, "but I'll need silence too, and no one should interrupt me." Rodrigo hesitated. For a second he looked like he was about to back down, but pride was stronger than reason. He nodded to one of the engineers. "Give her a computer, and everyone stays quiet." As they dragged a workstation over to the bench where Isabella was sitting, Marlene approached her daughter, her face tight with worry. "Isabella, are you sure?" The girl took her mother's hand and squeezed it lightly. "I know what I'm doing, Mom." Marlene wanted to believe her, but when she looked at Rodrigo, at the engineers, at the security cameras recording everything, she felt a pang in her chest. Because she knew that, at that moment, her daughter wasn't just accepting a challenge. She was stepping into an arena where few survived intact. The computer was placed on a folding table in the hallway. It was a direct access terminal to the building's central core, the same interface the engineers used to monitor the artificial intelligence systems. Isabella sat down in front of the screen, adjusted the plastic chair, and for the first time in weeks, felt a flutter in her stomach. It wasn't fear, it was something different, a kind of mutual recognition, like when two wild animals lock eyes in the forest and decide silently whether to fight or retreat. She knew the core was watching. Behind her, Rodrigo crossed his arms and leaned against the wall, his eyes fixed on the girl like someone watching a circus performance. The engineers crowded around, some curious, others skeptical. Marlene stood a few feet back, wringing her hands in her apron. Isabella took a deep breath and began to type. First, she accessed the system logs, thousands of lines of code that recorded every action of the building over the past 3 weeks. She didn't understand it all. She wasn't a programmer, but she understood patterns, and patterns she had discovered long ago were the world's secret language. As she scrolled through the screens, something caught her eye. The times of the malfunctions coincided with peaks in human noise, loud voices, slamming doors, heated arguments. The more aggressive the sound, the more intense the system's reaction. Isabella clicked on a secondary tab and opened the audio files recorded by the internal sensors. She put on the headphones someone had left on the table and started to listen. The first recordings were just ordinary noises, footsteps, conversations, the hum of the air conditioning. But then, in the recording from last Tuesday at 2:37 p.m., she heard Rodrigo's voice, loud, sharp, full of contempt. "If you don't fix this today, you're all fired. I don't pay to hear excuses." Immediately after his words, the floor's lights began to flash frantically. The elevators jammed. A glass door slammed shut, startling those present. Isabella paused the recording and went back a few hours. She found another moment, one of the engineers yelling at an assistant, calling him incompetent. Seconds later, the ventilation system kicked in, filling the hallway with icy air. She went back even further in time. She found mocking laughter, insults disguised as jokes, acidic comments about lower-level employees, and with every sound of cruelty the building reacted. Isabella slowly took off the headphones, her eyes fixed on the screen. Her heart was pounding, but her mind was calm, crystal clear. "The system isn't broken," she said, her voice low but clear. Rodrigo frowned. What? Isabella turned in her chair and looked directly at him. The system isn't broken. It's learning. And what it learned from you. A heavy silence fell over the hallway. The engineers exchanged confused glances. Rodrigo took a step forward, his eyes narrowed. Explain that properly. Isabella pointed to the screen. You programmed the building to learn from the people inside it, right? To adapt to human behavior, to anticipate needs, to understand users. Yes, Rodrigo said, impatient. So it understood. But what he understood wasn't love, respect, or cooperation. He understood rage, contempt, and arrogance. Because that's what you show here, every single day. The silence was absolute now. Even the distant hum of the air conditioning seemed to have stopped. Rodrigo opened his mouth, but no words came out. Isabella continued. Every time someone yells, slams a door, humiliates another person, the system registers it. And since it was programmed to imitate, it does the same. The lights flicker because you yell. The doors lock because you slam them. The speakers whisper because you badmouth each other when you think no one's listening. One of the younger engineers stepped forward, his voice trembling. But that doesn't make sense. It's just an algorithm. It doesn't have consciousness. It doesn't need consciousness, Isabella replied patiently. It just needs to imitate. And imitating is what it does best. Rodrigo let out a short, nervous laugh. All right, smarty pants. So what do we do? Do we apologize to the building? Isabella didn't smile. No, we change what it learns. She turned back to the computer and began typing again. This time, she accessed the central learning files, the system's neural network, the building's digital heart. It was dangerous territory. One wrong command could shut everything down, erase years of programming, turn the core into an empty shell. But Isabella wasn't afraid. She located the emotional response module, the system that interpreted vocal tones, movement patterns, sound frequencies. And then, carefully, she began to rewrite it. Line by line, she adjusted the parameters. Instead of reacting to aggression, the system would now react only to empathy. Instead of amplifying anger, it would amplify collaboration. Instead of imitating contempt, it would imitate kindness. But something was still missing, one last layer, a trigger that would activate the change in a deep, visceral way. Isabella looked at the microphone embedded in the computer. She hesitated for a moment. Then, without warning anyone, she leaned closer to it and began to sing. It was a simple song, a melody her grandmother used to hum while cooking, something about birds, about dawn, about new beginnings. Isabella didn't have a beautiful voice. It was low, slightly off-key, but imbued with something undeniable: sincerity. As she sang, she continued typing the final lines of code. And, slowly, something began to happen. The lights stopped flickering. The hum of the elevators softened. The speakers, which had been whispering distorted echoes, now emitted a low, almost musical sound, as if the building itself were trying to follow along. When Isabella finished, she pressed enter, and the core breathed. Not literally, of course, but everyone there felt it, a digital sigh, an exhale of built-up tension, a release. The building was at peace. Isabella leaned back in her chair, her body limp with exhaustion. Rodrigo Altamira looked at her, then at the computer screen, then at the engineers around him, and for the first time in 3 weeks, he didn't know what to say. Rodrigo Altamira was not a man accustomed to silence. His life was made of noise, shouting negotiations, barking orders, bought applause. Silence, to him, had always been synonymous with emptiness, with failure, with something that needed to be filled immediately. But in that hallway, at 3:15 in the morning, the silence was absolute, and he couldn't break it. Isabella remained seated at the computer, her eyes closed, her chest rising and falling slowly. Marlene approached her daughter. placed a hand on her shoulder, and whispered something no one else heard. The girl nodded but didn't open her eyes. The engineers looked at each other, incredulous. Some checked their tablets, confirming what everyone already felt. The building was functioning perfectly. No glitches, no anomalies, no whispers. The core was finally in order. Rodrigo took a step forward, his hands trembling slightly. He opened his mouth to speak, but his voice failed. He tried again. How did you do that? Isabella slowly opened her eyes and looked at him. There was no triumph in her gaze, only exhaustion. I already told you. The system was imitating you. I just taught it to imitate something else. But how did you know? Rodrigo insisted, his voice rising. You're 13 years old. You're not a programmer. You're not an engineer. You haven't studied AI. How could you possibly know that was it? Isabella tilted her head as if the answer were obvious. Because I pay attention, and because I know what it's like to be treated as invisible. The sentence dropped like a stone into a lake. The ripples spread, reaching everyone present. One of the engineers looked away. Another cleared his throat, embarrassed. Even the corporate lawyer, who had seemed oblivious to everything until then, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Marlene squeezed her daughter's shoulder tighter, her eyes welling up. Rodrigo ran a hand over his face, taking a deep breath. When he looked back at Isabella, there was something different in his expression. Not exactly regret, but perhaps the beginning of a crack in the armor of certainty he had carried for decades. "All right," he said, his voice low. "You win. 100 million. I'll transfer the money tomorrow." Isabella shook her head. "I don't want the money." Rodrigo blinked, confused. "What?" "I don't want the money," Isabella repeated calmly. "But I want you to do 3 things. Rodrigo crossed his arms, his eyebrow raised. 3 things? Like what? Isabella stood up from her chair, picked up her worn notebook, and held it against her chest. "First, my mom gets a promotion. She won't be cleaning floors anymore. She'll be supervisor of the maintenance teams for this building, with a decent salary, fixed hours, and full benefits." Marlene's eyes widened, her mouth agape. Rodrigo hesitated, but nodded. "Done. And the second?" "Second, you're going to create a scholarship program for the children of cleaning, security, and maintenance staff. Not just for this building, but for all your companies. Anyone who wants to study programming, engineering, whatever, will have support." A murmur went through the group of engineers. Rodrigo pursed his lips, but didn't refuse. "Okay. And the third?" Isabella took a step forward and looked directly into Rodrigo Altamira's eyes. When she spoke, her voice was firm but not aggressive. It was the voice of someone who knew her own worth. "Third, you're going to change how you treat people in here. It's not about the system, it's about you. If you want the building to function, you need to be better. It's that simple." The silence returned, but this time it was different. It was a silence that weighed heavily, that demanded a response, that couldn't be ignored. Rodrigo Altamira, a man who could have bought the world and silenced any dissent, found himself facing a 13-year-old girl who had just accomplished what no team of millionaire consultants could: fix the impossible. And she wasn't asking for money. She was asking for dignity. Rodrigo swallowed hard. He glanced at the engineers, the security guards, at Marlene, who was now silently weeping. Then he looked back at Isabella. And for the first time in a long time, he spoke the truth. "I don't know if I can be better." Isabella smiled, a small, almost sad smile. "Then learn. The building learned. You can too." Rodrigo stood frozen for a long moment, as if locked in an internal battle. Finally, he extended his hand. "All right, I accept all 3 conditions." Isabella shook his hand. It was small, calloused from the pens she held daily, but firm. When they released their grip, Rodrigo turned to the engineers, his voice weary but clear. "Meeting adjourned. Everyone can go home. We'll make the final adjustments tomorrow." As people began to disperse, Marlene hugged her daughter tightly, her muffled sobs against the girl's shoulder. "You're amazing," she whispered. "You're so amazing." Isabella held her mother back, her eyes closed, her heart finally at peace. And somewhere within the walls of the core, in the fiber optics and digital circuits, the building registered that embrace. And it learned, for the first time, what love was. The news spread like wildfire. The next morning, tech portals worldwide blared the same headline: 13-year-old girl solves billion-dollar building bug engineers couldn't fix. There were videos of the meeting, recorded by security cameras and mysteriously leaked to the press. Isabella wasn't fully visible in the footage, but her voice was audible. And the final scene, when Rodrigo shook her hand, went viral in seconds. Social media exploded. Some called Isabella a genius. Others questioned the story's veracity. But the majority, the overwhelming majority, celebrated. A black girl, the daughter of a janitor, had defeated a billionaire's arrogance using only intelligence, empathy, and courage. Rodrigo Altamira woke to dozens of calls. His PR team was in a panic. Investors wanted explanations. But strangely, Rodrigo himself was calm. He had coffee alone on the top floor of the core, looking out the window at the distant ocean. The building was quiet, not dead quiet, but harmoniously quiet. The lights weren't flickering. The elevators glided smoothly. The air conditioning whispered like a breeze. For the first time in weeks, Rodrigo felt at peace within his own creation. When he went down to the lobby, he found Marlene there. She wore a new uniform, no longer the faded navy blue, but a grey administrative set with a supervisor's badge hanging from her neck. She held a clipboard and was talking to two technicians about the elevator maintenance on the 5th floor. Rodrigo stopped a few feet away, observing. Marlene spoke with authority, but also with kindness. She listened to her employees' concerns, asked questions, jotted down suggestions. She wasn't just a boss, she was a leader. When she noticed Rodrigo, she turned and greeted him with a polite nod. "Good morning, Mr. Altamira." "Good morning, Marlene," he replied, the word sounding strange on his tongue. It was the first time he'd called a cleaning staff member by her name. Marlene noticed his hesitation and smiled faintly. "Is there a problem with the building?" "No," Rodrigo said, the word almost a confession. "Everything is perfect, actually." Marlene nodded, returning her attention to the clipboard. "Glad to hear it. Isabella will be happy to know that." Rodrigo cleared his throat. "Is she here?" "She's in the library on the 10th floor. Said she wanted to get some studying done before her afternoon classes." Rodrigo thanked her with a nod and headed for the elevators. Inside the mirrored cabin, he looked at his reflection. Tired eyes, unshaven face, rumpled suit. He looked older than he was. Or perhaps he was just starting to see his own age. When the doors opened on the 10th floor, he found the library empty, save for a small figure sitting by the window. Isabella had her notebook open on her lap, but she wasn't writing. She was just watching the city below, the cars, the people, the constant flow of life that went on, indifferent to the glass towers. Rodrigo approached slowly, hands in his pockets. "May I sit down?" Isabella looked up, surprised, but nodded. Rodrigo pulled up a chair and sat beside her, maintaining a respectful distance. For a long moment, neither spoke. They just watched the city together. Finally, Rodrigo broke the silence. "I spent all night thinking about what you said, about paying attention, about being invisible." Isabella turned her head, curious. And I realized I've spent my entire life not paying attention to almost anything. I built this building, made it think, learn, react, but I never stopped to consider what I was teaching it. He looked at his own hands, the lines etched by age and stress. "You're right. The problem was never the system. It was me." Isabella slowly closed her notebook. "You're not the only arrogant person in the world, you know, but you might be one of the few who admits it," Rodrigo let out a short, bitter laugh. Admitting it is easy. Changing is the hard part. It is, Isabella agreed. But the building changed. And it doesn't even have a body or a heart, just code. If it could, you can too. Rodrigo looked at the girl with an expression that mixed admiration with something akin to shame. How did you get so smart? Isabella shrugged. I'm not that smart. I just pay attention. And I read a lot. What are you reading now? Isabella opened her backpack and pulled out a well-worn hardcover book. Artificial Intelligence, a Modern Approach. Rodrigo's eyes widened. You understand that? Some of it, Isabella admitted. I'm still learning other parts, but I like to try. Rodrigo fell silent, processing. Then he did something that surprised himself. He took out his phone, dialed a number, and when they answered said, "Hello, Beatrice, it's me. I want you to organize a meeting with the HR team. We're going to need to structure that scholarship program I mentioned yesterday. I want it up and running in a month. No, it's not a suggestion. It's an order." He hung up and looked at Isabella. There, first change. Isabella smiled, a genuine smile that lit up her tired face. Thank you. No, Rodrigo said, his voice firm. Thank you. He stood up, straightened his suit and walked toward the door. But before he left, he turned one last time. Isabella, if you ever want to work here, the doors are always open. Not as an employee, as a partner. Someone who helps shape the future of this place. Isabella tilted her head, thoughtful. I'll think about it, but first I want to finish school. Rodrigo chuckled, a light, genuine laugh. And for the first time in years, Rodrigo Altamira left a conversation, feeling like he'd learned something. That afternoon, the Corps underwent its first major post-Isabella transformation. The maintenance teams received new uniforms, better salaries, and fixed schedules. A suggestion board was installed on the ground floor, where any employee could anonymously post ideas for workplace improvements. And most importantly, Rodrigo instituted a new policy. Every team meeting would begin with 2 minutes of silence, during which anyone present could, if they wished, publicly thank someone who had helped them that week. At first, it was awkward, embarrassing even. But gradually, people started to speak. And the building, which heard everything through its senses, began to learn a new language, the language of gratitude. The lights stopped flickering for good. The elevators became the most reliable in the city. And on nights of absolute silence, when only the night security guards walked the halls, people said you could hear a faint, almost imperceptible melody coming from the speakers, the same song Isabella had sung that early morning. No one knew for sure if it was a programmed echo or something more, but everyone agreed the Corps had a soul now. And who gave it that soul? Not a billionaire, not a tech genius, not an award-winning engineer. It was a 13-year-old girl with a worn notebook and a heart that still knew how to listen. 5 years passed. The Corps became a global benchmark, not just as a smart building, but as a symbol of something greater, proof that technology without humanity is just cold metal and empty code. Companies from all over the world came to study the model implemented there. Not the algorithms or the sensors, but the culture, the way people were treated, the respect embedded in every protocol. Rodrigo Altamira had aged, not just in years, but in depth. The wrinkles around his eyes were more pronounced, but they were accompanied by a softer gaze. He had slowly learned to listen before speaking, to ask before ordering. And above all, he had learned that leading wasn't about control, but about care. The scholarship program created at Isabella's request had benefited over 200 children and young adults. Some were already working at major tech companies. Others had followed different paths: medicine, architecture, education. But all carried with them the same lesson: origin doesn't define destiny. Marlene, now 47, was the director of operations at the core and the general supervisor of all maintenance units for Rodrigo's business group. Her name appeared in conference lineups, her testimony inspired other women, but she never forgot where she came from. Every morning, before heading up to her office, Marlene would go down to the ground floor and greet each cleaner, each security guard, each technician by name, because she knew what it felt like to be invisible, and she vowed that no one under her leadership would ever go through that. And Isabella? Isabella was now 18. She had finished high school with exceptional grades and had been accepted into 3 prestigious universities, 2 in Brazil, 1 in the United States. She chose to stay, not for lack of ambition, but because she believed that the most profound changes happen from the inside out, from the bottom up. She was studying computer science at the city's public university, with a full scholarship from the program she herself had helped create. In her spare time, she volunteered, teaching basic programming to children from underserved communities at community centers. And once a month, she returned to the core, not as a visitor, but as a consultant, because Rodrigo had kept his promise. Isabella was, officially, the building's technical and ethical advisor. She participated in strategic meetings, reviewed expansion projects, and whenever a new artificial intelligence system was implemented, she was the first to test it. Not with code, but with simple questions. Does this system learn from empathy or from fear? Does it amplify people's best selves or their worst? If a 13-year-old girl looked at this, would she feel included or excluded? The questions at first bothered the engineers, but over time they learned to value them. Because Isabella had the rare gift of seeing not just what technology did, but what it meant. It was a Thursday afternoon when Isabella entered the auditorium on the 20th floor for an internal lecture. The topic was 5 years of transformation. Rodrigo had invited her to speak, but she had politely declined. She didn't like the spotlight. She preferred the backstage, where the real changes happened, but she agreed to attend. The auditorium was packed. Employees from all levels, executives, analysts, technicians, cleaning crews, sat side by side. There was no longer a visible hierarchy in the seating. Rodrigo stepped onto the stage, adjusted the microphone, and began to speak. 5 years ago, this building almost destroyed me. Not because it failed, but because I failed. I built a machine that learned, but I didn't teach it what was worth learning. And when everything fell apart, it was a 13-year-old girl who showed me the simplest and most difficult truth in the world. Technology is not neutral. It reflects who we are. He paused, his eyes scanning the auditorium until they found Isabella sitting in the last row. Isabella taught me that intelligence without empathy is just calculation, that innovation without dignity is just vanity, and that no building, however intelligent, can be better than the people who inhabit it. Applause echoed through the auditorium. Isabella looked away, embarrassed, but Marlene, sitting next to her, squeezed her hand gently. Rodrigo continued, "Today, the core is recognized worldwide, but what I'm most proud of are not the awards, nor the magazine features. It's the fact that no one here is invisible. And that, my friends, is priceless." More applause. But this time, Isabella noticed something different. It wasn't just polite applause, it was genuine. It came from people who, like her and her mother, knew the weight of invisibility, and who now, finally, felt seen. When the lecture ended and people began to disperse, Rodrigo came down from the stage and walked over to Isabella. "You didn't want to speak, but I want you to know, none of this would exist without you." Isabella shook her head. "It would exist. It just might have taken longer." Rodrigo smiled, always so humble. "It's not humility," Isabella corrected. "It's just knowing I did my part, and that now it's everyone's job to keep it going." Rodrigo nodded, thoughtful. Then he extended his hand. "Thank you, Isabella, for everything. She shook his hand, firm, just as she had 5 years before. But this time there was no challenge, only mutual respect. That night, after everyone else had gone home, Isabella returned to the 10th floor, to the library where it had all begun. She sat in the same chair by the window and opened her notebook. No longer the worn-out one from 5 years ago, but a new one, with a hard cover and blank pages. She wrote just one sentence: "The machines learn from us, and us, who do we learn from?" She closed the notebook slowly and looked out the window. Down below, the city glittered, infinite and indifferent. But inside, within this 60-story building, something had changed, not just in the circuits and algorithms, but in the people, in the way they spoke to each other, the way they listened, the way they saw each other. Isabella smiled to herself and whispered, so low only she could hear, "We did it, Grandma." And somewhere within the walls of the core, in the fiber optic cables and digital memories, the building registered that whisper and kept it, just as it kept all the voices that mattered, because now, finally, it knew what was worth learning. They say that even today, on very quiet nights when the city sleeps and only the distant lights of the ocean shimmer against the glass, it's possible to hear a soft melody coming from the core's speakers. It's not a programmed song, it's not in any system file, but it's there. Some say it's just an echo, a fragment of code that refuses to disappear. Others believe it's something more, the digital memory of a moment when a girl taught a machine to feel. Isabella, now an adult, continues her life. She works on social tech projects, developing systems that connect underserved communities to digital education, and always ensures that the people behind the screens are treated with dignity. Marlene retired at 50, but she didn't stop working. She started her own consulting firm, helping companies structure maintenance teams with respect and professionalism. Her motto was simple: no one is invisible here. And Rodrigo? Rodrigo learned that being a billionaire didn't make him better than anyone else, that money bought comfort, but not wisdom, and that the most valuable lesson of his life had been given to him for free by a girl with a worn-out notebook and a heart that still believed in kindness. The core still stands, gleaming and silent, a beacon of glass and metal by the sea. But it's no longer just a building. It's a symbol, proof that even the most rigid structures can learn, can change, can become better, and that sometimes the deepest answers don't come from the most powerful. They come from the voices we learn to hear when we stop shouting. And you, who have followed this story this far, what did you think? Did this journey make you reflect on anything? On how we treat the people around us, on what we teach without realizing it to the world we are building? Leave your comment, share what you felt, and if you haven't subscribed yet, subscribe to the channel to receive moving and transformative stories every day, because every voice deserves to be heard, and every story deserves to be told.